The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating Base Falcon, a lonely outpost carved into the dust and silence of hostile terrain. Soldiers shuffled through their routines, checking weapons, scanning horizons, and waiting for orders. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, a figure who never quite fit the mold of those around her. Her gear was standard, her rifle immaculate, but her boots, those battered, scarred leather boots, drew eyes and whispered comments. Their soles were worn thin, the laces replaced 3 times over, and etched faintly on the side was an insignia that most didn't notice. But one officer did. Captain Raymond Doyle, tall, sharp-jawed, and proud of his pristine uniform, paused as Sarah passed by. He tilted his head down at her boots, then scoffed loud enough for the men nearby to hear. "Lieutenant, are you planning to march into a war zone or beg for spare change at the gate? Those boots look like they've been through 3 lifetimes of battles." The squad chuckled softly, uneasy at the public ridicule but unwilling to draw Doyle's ire. Sarah glanced down at her boots, then up at him, her eyes steady and unreadable. "Sir, these boots are mine to wear," she replied calmly. Doyle sneered. "No soldier under my command parades around in rags. Tomorrow you'll have new issue gear, or you'll answer for insubordination." Sarah didn't argue. She simply nodded once and walked on, her steps quiet but purposeful. What Doyle didn't know was that the boots were more than just worn-out leather. They were a legacy, a bond to someone who had once fought under the harshest skies of Europe. Her father's boots, passed down after he fell in service, a man who had once fought alongside legends like Audie Murphy. The etched insignia on the side wasn't decoration. It was a unit crest, scarred by fire, carried through blood, mud, and victory. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from, and if you love these stories, hit subscribe now. The next one will blow your mind, and it's even crazier. Night fell over the base, the desert air turning cold and heavy. Sarah sat alone on a crate near the perimeter, quietly cleaning her M4 carbine. She thought of the day her father handed her the boots. The way his voice had cracked when he said, "Every step in these boots is a reminder. Courage isn't about how you look, it's about how you stand when it matters." Her reflection was broken by the sudden blare of alarms. Red lights pulsed across the outpost. Shouts filled the air. An ambush. From the dark ridges surrounding the base, muzzle flashes erupted. Mortar shells arced overhead and crashed into the compound, shaking earth and steel. Sarah sprang to her feet, boots pounding the dirt, rifle at the ready. Soldiers scrambled, ducking for cover, returning fire where they could. Captain Doyle barked orders, his voice rising in panic more than control. "Hold the line! Get those gunners up front! Where's my perimeter team?" But chaos drowned him out. A mortar hit close to the command tent, throwing soldiers to the ground. Dust and smoke swallowed the air. Doyle staggered, his composure cracking. His polished boots were covered in ash, his voice trembling as he clutched a radio that gave only static. Sarah moved past him, her eyes sharp, her hands steady on her rifle. She took position at the front barricade, squeezing the trigger in controlled bursts, each shot finding its mark. The squad, seeing her confidence, rallied around her. "Lieutenant Hayes, where do you want us?" shouted Corporal Jackson, blood streaking his cheek but his will unbroken. "Flank left! Cut off their advance on the fuel depot," Sarah ordered without hesitation. Her voice carried authority, not from rank, but from conviction. The men obeyed. They trusted her. Captain Doyle froze, staring at the way the soldiers turned from his panic to her calm. He tried to shout over her, but another mortar exploded nearby, sending him diving for cover. Sarah didn't flinch. She rose from the dirt, boots coated in dust and blood, and continued firing. Minutes turned into an hour of relentless combat. Sarah fought with precision, her rifle an extension of her will. When ammo ran low, she grabbed a fallen machine gun, bracing it against the barricade and unleashing a storm of fire. Her arms trembled with the weapon's recoil, but she held steady, pushing back wave after wave of attackers. At one point, a grenade landed near the barricade. Without thinking, Sarah kicked it back over the wall with the toe of her worn boots, the insignia flashing in the glow of the explosion that followed. The squad roared with renewed courage. As dawn bled into the horizon, the enemy finally retreated, leaving behind silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the groans of the wounded. The base was battered, but it stood. And it stood because Sarah Hayes never bent, never broke. When the dust settled, Captain Doyle emerged from the rubble, his uniform torn, his pride in tatters. He walked toward Sarah, his steps hesitant. She sat on the edge of the barricade, catching her breath, her boots resting in the dirt, scarred but unyielding. His eyes dropped again to the boots. For the first time, he noticed the faint, etched insignia, the mark of a unit that had faced hell itself in the European theater decades ago. His eyes widened as recognition dawned. Those belong to, he whispered. My father, Sarah said, her voice low but steady. He wore them in battle before I was born. He died wearing them. I wear them to remember who I fight for and why I don't run. Doyle swallowed hard, shame cutting deeper than any wound. The same boots he mocked had carried a hero. The same boots had carried Sarah through fire while he cowered. He stood there, silent, the weight of his failure pressing down. Sarah rose, slinging her rifle across her back, and began walking toward the wounded to help. Doyle stared after her, his gaze fixed on the boots that had survived more wars than he ever would. The men of the squad gathered around Sarah, offering nods of respect, their trust in her unshakable now. They didn't care about ranks or regulations in that moment. They knew who had saved them. From that day forward, no one at the base ever questioned her boots again. They weren't rags. They weren't disgraceful. They were the symbol of courage carried from one generation to the next. And though Captain Doyle never spoke of it aloud, he carried the shame of his words like a scar, a reminder of the day he mocked a soldier's boots, until he saw the legacy etched into them. The Scottish Highlands were cold that morning, the fog curling over the hills like smoke from a battlefield long past. NATO's multinational training camp buzzed with the usual noise of engines, boots, and soldiers preparing for drills. Among the rows of freshly issued uniforms and spotless gear stood Sergeant Emily Carter, her presence quiet but unshakably steady. She wasn't dressed like the others. Her uniform was regulation, her rifle flawless, but her boots were scuffed, scratched, and patched from years of wear. On the outer leather, faint but unmistakable, was an insignia carefully carved, the crest of the British SAS regiment. Captain Hughes, a British officer with a polished chest full of ribbons and a reputation for arrogance, caught sight of her as she passed. He stopped, narrowing his eyes at the worn boots. His voice carried across the camp as he laughed. Sergeant Carter, are those relics you're dragging around supposed to pass for combat gear? Did you dig them out of a museum? A few soldiers chuckled awkwardly, looking at Emily to see if she'd react. She simply met Hughes's gaze, calm and unflinching. These boots belonged to a soldier who earned them, she said quietly. Hughes scoffed. Well, I hope you don't expect the enemy to bow at the sight of your shabby footwear. Appearance matters. Respect comes from discipline. Emily didn't answer. She just walked past, the insignia on her boots catching the faint glow of the morning sun. No one there realized that those boots once carried her grandfather, an SAS operator who had stood shoulder to shoulder with men like Andy McNabb during missions so dangerous they were spoken of only in whispers. To Emily, every step in those boots was a vow she would live up to the name carved into them. The day went on with drills and exercises, soldiers running simulations across the hills. But just as the sun began to sink behind the ridges, the camp's rhythm shattered. The first gunshots came from the east, sharp cracks slicing through the wind. Then came the echoes of engines and shouts in a language no one expected to hear there. A rogue militia, armed and organized, stormed the training ground. Mortar shells whistled overhead, slamming into the outskirts of the camp. Alarms blared. Soldiers scrambled for real weapons instead of blanks. Panic rippled through the camp like wildfire. Hughes shouted orders, but his words were drowned by the roar of explosions. The training exercise was gone. This was war. Emily dropped into cover behind a sandbag wall, her rifle snapping into her hands with practiced ease. Her heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She scanned through her scope and picked out the militia fighters advancing through the fog. Calmly, she exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and one fell. Then another. Her shots were precise, efficient, merciless. Beside her, young Corporal Davis trembled as bullets tore into the dirt around them. "What do we do, Sarge?" he shouted, his voice breaking. Emily's boots pressed into the earth as she steadied him with a glance. "We hold. Focus your fire on the ridgeline. Don't let them push past." Davis nodded, his fear tempered by her composure. The militia's advance was relentless. They moved like wolves, cutting off the outer patrols, circling toward the fuel depot. Hughes barked into a radio, but static was his only reply. When an RPG exploded near the command tent, he ducked behind crates, clutching his pistol like a lifeline. His sharp uniform was smeared with mud, his polished boots caked with ash. Emily, meanwhile, saw the fight for what it was: survive or be overrun. She sprinted across the camp under fire, her boots pounding against gravel, the insignia flashing as if reminding her why she stood unshaken. She reached the armory, pulled out a .50 caliber sniper rifle, and climbed to the top of a watchtower that trembled under artillery strikes. Through her scope, she saw them. Dozens of militia fighters pouring from the tree line, heavy weapons glinting in the dim light. She steadied her breath, her finger curled around the trigger. The first shot cracked like thunder, and a machine gunner dropped. Another shot, another target fell. Her precision was surgical. Every pull of the trigger bought the camp more time, every fallen enemy soldier a chance for her squad to rally. But the militia wasn't giving up. A truck-mounted gun opened fire on the tower, the wood and steel exploding around her. Splinters tore into her arms, but she didn't flinch. She rolled, reloaded, and returned fire, her bullets smashing through the windshield and silencing the gun. Below, the soldiers began to follow her lead. Inspired by her courage, they regrouped, forming firing lines, covering each other's movements. Davis yelled out, "She's holding them back! Move up!" And suddenly the tide shifted. In the chaos, Hughes crawled toward Emily's position, his face pale, sweat streaking through dirt. He looked up at her boots as she knelt to reload, the insignia carved into the leather glinting through dust and blood. Recognition struck him like a blow. "That mark," he whispered. "That's SAS, that's McNabb's unit." Emily didn't look at him. She fired another shot, dropping an enemy soldier before replying. "My grandfather wore them on missions you'll never read about, Captain. He fought so I could stand here today. I don't need new boots. I need soldiers who don't break when the fight comes to them." Hughes said nothing. His earlier mockery burned in his chest like acid. While he hid, she fought. While he judged, she led. The battle raged deep into the night. Emily never stopped. Her arms ached, her ears rang, but her aim never wavered. When her sniper rifle finally jammed, she grabbed her M4 and kept firing, her boots braced against the edge of the barricade. Every soldier who looked her way saw not just a sergeant, but the embodiment of a legacy they all wished they had the strength to carry. By dawn, the militia broke. Their dead littered the hillside, their survivors scattering back into the fog they'd crawled from. The camp stood battered but unbroken. Silence settled. Smoke drifted. The wounded were carried to medics. The exhausted slumped against walls. Emily stood in the wreckage, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her boots coated in mud, ash, and blood. The insignia carved into them was blackened, but still visible. Captain Hughes approached, his pride in ruins, his voice quiet. "Sergeant Carter, I was wrong." Emily looked at him, her face streaked with grime, but her eyes unwavering. "Respect isn't in polished leather, Captain. It's in standing your ground when everything else falls apart." He lowered his gaze, ashamed. The same boots he mocked had carried not just her, but the weight of a legacy older and greater than himself. He saluted her then, not because of rank, but because she had earned what no ribbon could grant. From that day forward, no soldier in that camp dared laugh at her boots again. They weren't worn-out leather. They weren't relics. They were a reminder that courage passes through generations, and sometimes the smallest scars carry the biggest stories, and in the quiet after the storm, every soldier who had fought beside her knew one truth. The battle had been won not by rank or polished command, but by a woman in scuffed boots, carved with the mark of legends, who refused to break. Afghanistan's nights were long, cold, and heavy with silence, the kind of silence that made soldiers restless because they knew it wouldn't last. Forward operating post ironclad sat like a lone scar against the barren hills, a cluster of steel and sandbags waiting to be tested. Inside the perimeter, Corporal Jessica Monroe moved with quiet focus, checking her squad's gear, running hands over weapons, counting ammunition by touch and memory. Her routine was second nature, drilled into her from years of discipline. But one thing about her never blended in: her boots. They were worn, scarred, and far from regulation shine. Etched into the side was a faint insignia, faded but undeniable, the screaming eagle of the 101st Airborne Division. Most soldiers overlooked it, but one officer did not. Colonel Abrams, a visitor from high command, paced the grounds with the sharp eye of a man looking for flaws. When he saw Jessica's boots, he stopped, smirk tugging at his lips. "Corporal, did supply run out of proper footwear, or are you just collecting battlefield souvenirs?" His tone was mocking, sharp enough for nearby troops to hear. Jessica looked at him, her face calm, her posture unshaken. "Sir, these boots carry more than leather and laces," Abrams chuckled. "They carry embarrassment, Corporal. A soldier's discipline starts with how they wear their gear. Don't expect to be taken seriously dressed like that." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but Jessica didn't argue. She simply nodded once, her eyes steady. Abrams turned away, shaking his head, his polished boots clicking against the gravel. He never cared to ask whose boots they had been, never cared to notice the insignia etched into the leather, carved by a hand long gone. Those boots had once belonged to Sergeant Daniel Price, her mentor, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with General David Petraeus during a mission that saved dozens of lives. He'd given them to her before he was killed in an ambush, and every step Jessica took was in memory of him. Hours crawled by, and the night deepened. Soldiers rotated watch shifts, the sky heavy with stars. Jessica lay in her cot but didn't sleep. She had learned that the quietest hours often birthed the loudest storms. Just before dawn, it came. The first explosion rocked the east wall, a blinding flash followed by a roar that ripped the silence apart. Sirens screamed. Dust and fire filled the air. Shadows swarmed from the ridges, insurgents, dozens of them, armed with RPGs and heavy machine guns. Their war cries echoed in the valley as bullets tore into the base. Jessica leapt to her feet, boots slamming into the dirt, rifle in hand. Chaos spread like wildfire. Soldiers stumbled for cover, some still half asleep, others frozen in fear as mortars crashed into guard towers. Colonel Abrams barked orders into a radio, but the blasts drowned him out. When an RPG shredded the command post, his voice cracked. His polished boots stumbled backward, carrying him toward safety rather than the fight. Jessica didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the outer barricade, her M4 clutched tight, firing controlled bursts into the oncoming tide. Bullets ripped past her, slamming into sandbags, tearing through the night. She shouted commands to her squad, her voice clear and steady. "Get the wounded inside the bunkers. Reload and cover left flank. Don't let them breach." Her orders cut through the panic, pulling scattered soldiers into action. They followed not because of her rank, but because of the fire in her tone, the certainty in her stance. Colonel Abrams ducked behind a wall, clutching his sidearm like a talisman, his face pale. "Hold them back!" he yelled, but his words carried no weight. His men barely glanced at him. Their eyes were on Jessica. The insurgents pressed harder, a truck-mounted gun opening fire, spraying rounds that tore through defenses. Jessica grabbed a fallen M240B machine gun, braced it against the barricade, and unleashed a wall of fire. Her arms shook under the recoil, but she held steady, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. The ground around her was littered with shell casings, her boots braced deep into the dirt, as if rooted to the earth itself. An RPG slammed into the fuel depot, flames erupting skyward. The base shook, soldiers screamed, but Jessica didn't falter. She sprinted toward the blaze, rallying two others to flank the enemy, pushing through the gap. Smoke stung her eyes. Heat burned her skin, but she fought through it, every step echoing the memory of the mentor whose boots she wore. Through the smoke, a grenade clattered at her feet. Time slowed. Without thinking, Jessica kicked it back, the insignia on her boots flashing in the fiery glow before the explosion tore into the enemy ranks. Her squad cheered, their courage reignited, as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the battlefield in blood and fire. Jessica climbed a watchtower with the M240B, her silhouette framed against the rising sun. She rained fire down upon the insurgents, relentless, unyielding. One by one, their assault faltered. Their screams faded into retreat. The base was scarred, but it stood. Bodies lay scattered across the field. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the morning light. Soldiers moved among the wounded, their faces weary but alive. Jessica descended from the tower, her rifle slung across her back, her boots heavy with ash and blood. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were calm. The insignia carved into the leather was blackened, but still visible. Colonel Abrams emerged from behind the rubble, his uniform torn, his face lined with shame. He walked slowly toward her, his voice unsteady. "You held the line," he said. His gaze dropped to her boots, and for the first time, he noticed the insignia. His eyes widened. "That mark. The 101st. That's Price's unit." Jessica nodded. "He gave me these boots before he fell. I wear them because every step is his memory, and a promise I won't run when the fight comes." Abrams swallowed, his pride crushed under the weight of his cowardice. He had mocked her for the very thing that made her stronger than him. While he hid, she had fought. While he stumbled, she had stood. The soldiers gathered, nodding at Jessica with respect that no regulation could command. She wasn't just another corporal. She was their anchor, their strength, their proof that courage wasn't in shiny leather, but in the will to fight when everything else broke. From that day forward, no one questioned her boots again. They weren't rags. They weren't shameful. They were legacy. And as the sun rose fully over the battlefield, Jessica tightened her laces, ready for the next fight, the next dawn, the next storm. Because she knew war wasn't about how clean you entered it. It was about whether you stood your ground when it came crashing down.